Hello, and welcome to the Washington Monthly, your source for policy, politics, and fresh ideas. I'm your host, Ann Kim.
And I'm your co-host, Garrett Epps.
In this episode, a temperature check on the status of voting rights. After the 2020 election, Donald Trump and his army of election deniers threatened a slew of changes to voting rights that could disenfranchise thousands and potentially millions of voters. How worried should we be? Our guest is Joshua Douglas, a professor at the University of Kentucky School of Law and one of the nation's foremost authorities on voting rights. Welcome, Josh. Thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So, Josh, you've written a lot about voting and voting rights for the Monthly, and your most recent article was a rejoinder to the threats coming from Donald Trump and the MAGA folks about the changes they want to see to make it harder to vote. Paper ballots, no early voting, proof of citizenship, that kind of thing. But you also argue that those changes aren't actually going to be that easy for Trump to make because of what you call the decentralized nature of our election system. So can you explain a little bit about what that idea is and if there's any reason to think that might change?
Yeah, so it's perhaps one of the virtues of our election system, also one of its perils. I think there are both good and bad things about the way we run elections in the United States. But the basic gist is that we don't generally have a centralized election clearinghouse or agency that runs all of our elections. Elections are run at the local level. I often say that we don't really have one election day. We have 50, 51 with DC and you add the territories, but 51 election days that all happen simultaneously. And actually, we have thousands of election days that all happen simultaneously because local election officials run elections and states have the authority to determine the rules for elections when it comes to eligibility, when it comes to the various aspects of voting policies. And that's why, just to give an easy example, you might see different voting machines across states or across even within one state. They might have different voting machines because this is very much of local control. Now, the U.S. Constitution says that the times, places, and manner of running elections shall be determined by the states. And then it also says that Congress can come in and alter or amend those regulations. And so there is a role for Congress here, but it is given in the first instance to the states.
Well, you say that as President Trump doesn't have a lot of power to change the voting rules on his own. He does seem to want to do that. And recently, at least, he made this feint at conditioning disaster aid to California on changes in their voting laws. We've got a clip from him here.
In California, we want them to have voter ID so the people have a voice, because right now the people don't have a voice because you don't know who's voting, and it's very corrupt.
What other weapons do you think he has?
Well, the point here is that the Constitution doesn't give the president any sort of unilateral power over running elections. As I mentioned before, the Constitution says that states get the first cut at determining election rules, and then Congress can come in and change those rules for federal elections if it wants to. So the president can't just declare that, California has to have a voter ID law. Now, yes, the president has some powers with respect to its executive orders, and we're seeing the courts pushing back already on the scope of some of these executive orders because Trump just can't make law through executive orders in any way that he wants to. The real question is, how strong will courts stand against those? But when it comes to elections, the presidency simply doesn't have any powers to run elections as he wants. It's up to the states and up to Congress. So Trump can say whatever he wants to say, but with respect to the rule of law, assuming the courts hold, Trump doesn't have the power to just impose his will on how a state runs its elections.
So it looks like, we might be seeing something play out again, as we have in other places with president versus Congress, because in theory, there are a number of federal laws that protect voting rights. Obviously, there's the Voting Rights Act of 1965, but you've also mentioned the National Voter Registration Act. That's the so-called motor voter law that lets you register at the DMV. We've had the Help America Vote Act that sets up the clearinghouse for best practices in election administration. And then the Military and Overseas Voter Empowerment Act, which I think makes it easier for expatriates and soldiers stationed abroad to vote. So, given this suite of federal laws protecting the right to vote, how much protection are they going to offer when you've got an administration that seems kind of hostile to voting
Yeah,
rights?
and so like any good law school answer, the answer here is it depends, and it depends on the law, and it depends on the scope of what it's being protected. So, when you talk about the Voting Rights Act of 1965, one of the most important civil rights act in our history, which provides a lot of protections, and it also does in many places rely on the Department of Justice to enforce some of those rules. And so certainly Trump has the authority to direct his Department of Justice to not be particularly robust in the way that it's enforcing the various voter protections within the act, and not sending in federal observers, refusing to file lawsuits or join lawsuits with respect to challenges to voting practices. So yes, there's a lot of authority there in terms of how strongly those laws can have an effect to protect voters if Trump directs his Department of Justice to simply not be involved. And I suspect that is what's going to happen. On the other hand, some of these laws just provide mandates to states because, again, we have a state focused and a state centric manner of running our elections. And some of these rules, saying things, for example, about military and overseas voters and by when ballots have to be sent, the deadlines to make sure that they arrive in time, those sorts of things. Those are rules directed at states. And so, the Trump administration can't tell a state don't comply with a validly enacted federal law that uh, provides various mandates that protect voters. So I do think we're going to see a lot less voting rights enforcement. There's no question about that, given the administration's priorities and what he's going to tell the Department of Justice. But that still doesn't absolve states from complying with these various laws. Now, here's the rub, though. Many of these statutes will require lawsuits, right? If a state is deciding not to comply with the Voting Rights Act, that requires someone to sue. And so certainly we'll have private plaintiffs suing over Voting Rights Act infringements. The problem is if the Department of Justice also decides not to bring suit. And this has been something that's bubbling in the lower courts, where some lower courts have actually said that private plaintiffs are not allowed to bring lawsuits under the Voting Rights Act, that only the Department of Justice is allowed to. This is known as a private right of action. And now, so this has been bubbling in the lower courts. A couple of lower federal judges have said this. And this would be really concerning if the Supreme Court, for example, were to agree, because it would cut off the ability of private plaintiffs like organizations, the NAACP, for example, which is one of the organizations involved in one of these cases where the court said there's no right of private plaintiffs to bring suit. So if private plaintiffs can't bring suit and the Department of Justice won't bring suit under the Trump administration's policies, that's where you get a situation in which states can get away with not complying with the Voting Rights Act. So then you get a situation where the Voting Rights Act exists on the books, but no one's enforcing it.
Are you willing to hazard a guess on what the Supreme Court would do?
Trying to guess what the court will do is always a fool's errand. But I teach my students that how do you win at the Supreme Court? You count to five. So can they count to five for that notion that private plaintiffs can't bring suit? Contrary to all sorts of decades of precedent and practice, I think it's going to be hard to count to five. It probably won't be hard to count to three or maybe four who would espouse this idea.
And we should point out that you have a book that is available through bookstores everywhere called Supreme Court versus the Voters that people should read if they want to. The court versus the voters. And people should read this if they want to understand the kind of complicated and forbidding atmosphere of voting rights litigation under this current court. It's an excellent book.
Thanks. Yeah, and
Um,
the book really tells stories of why this court has gotten to the place it's done, and it's written for a lay audience, a non-legal audience. About just tells the underlying stories of some of the big cases some people have heard of, like Bush v. Gore or Citizens United. Some cases that people probably haven't heard of, but all have contributed to the court really under enforcing the fundamental right to vote.
Josh, while we are talking about federal statutes, the Speaker and the Republican majority have got a pet measure they want the new Congress to adapt called the SAVE Act, which would require every person registering to vote to prove in some specified ways that he or she is a citizen. Um, I've seen studies that say that as many as 9% of the eligible voters might not be able to comply with this. Um, how serious an impediment to voting would this be if it was passed, in your judgment?
I mean, it depends on the precise language of the law that would get passed. I mean, yes, there are some studies that say, as you said, 9% of voters simply don't have the documentation required to prove citizenship. But actually, the numbers could be even higher than that, depending on how robust the language is. I've seen some suggestions that some forms of this act would require every voter to show up in person to register to vote. That would be a massive undertaking that would fundamentally, make it extremely difficult for many people to get on the voter rolls or stay on the voter rolls. And this is a good example where states have different rules, and I think what works for one state maybe doesn't work for another state, and the federalist aspect of the way we run elections is of virtue here. And it's sort of ironic. Conservatives typically tout federalism as important and local control, and the SAVE Act would take away that local control when it comes to voter registration rules. As you said, maybe up to 9% of people don't have a birth certificate or passport, and it would cost money to obtain those documents, even if you were willing to jump through the hoops to get them. But also just the hardship of having to show up in person would be difficult. And then add in the problem of people whose names have changed between when they have their birth certificate and now, and think about the traditionally women who change their names after they get married, or maybe change them back after they get divorced, or whatever it is that causes people to have different names. There's so many problems inherent in this this idea for nothing, right? For what benefit? There's no evidence that non-citizens are voting to any measurable degree whatsoever. So this is a boogeyman that we're chasing that doesn't actually exist, but would cause a lot of problems. So I am very concerned with this proposal. The final thing I'll say about it is that it actually would go contrary to the history and tradition of voter registration. And this Supreme Court is so attuned to history and tradition. I have a new article that is in draft form that I've posted online for people to read, called "History and Tradition and Voter Registration," that looks at basically how voter registration started, and in particular, third parties in voter registration drives, groups like the League of Women Voters and others. And what I found is that since states began requiring voter registration, they've also made it very easy for third party organizations to help people get on the rolls. So you're starting to see these cutbacks in places like Florida, making it more difficult for third party organizations to engage in voter registration. I argue that's contrary to the history and tradition of voter registration. I think the SAVE Act would also be contrary to the history and tradition of voter registration in putting unnecessary hurdles on the process that really have never existed in history. I mean, of course, we have a long history of making it difficult for certain constituencies, for Black people, for racial minorities, having to do various tests and whatnot. But in terms of the registration system as a whole, we haven't had these same kinds of barriers.
I served as an election official in the last election, actually, for Fairfax County, Virginia. And I think I can say that something like the SAVE Act would be incredibly burdensome for election officials, too. Like 95%, 99% of the voters that we saw had a Virginia driver's license. And nobody had brought in a passport. And the rule in Virginia is that if the passport is expired for more than a year, we can't take it. So there would
Yeah.
be, extreme burdens, I think, on election officials, and then changes in state law that would have to happen, obviously,
Well,
to comply.
that's something I often remind people or tell, suggest to people that if you don't have election officials in the room when you're debating the new proposals for election laws, you're doing it wrong. One of the reasons we had actually a lot of success in Kentucky during the pandemic, we were talked about as a national success story in Kentucky for how to run elections. How does a red state, a so-called red state, get bipartisan agreement on how to run an election during a pandemic? And there are national stories done about this. And one of the reasons, among several others, was that we had local election officials as part of the conversation, so they could actually say, "Here's what works." And, because the people on the ground running elections, yes, often in some places they're elected Democrats or elected Republicans. And I think that's, crazy that we have a system where partisan officials are the ones that run our elections. But 99% of them take off their partisan hat and are really just in service of the voters and care about running a smooth election system. And so we need to listen to them. And I think you're right. Election officials all over would tell you that this SAVE Act is a terrible idea for the smooth administration of their elections.
So I just want to stay on the question of the states for a little bit. So you established that even if Trump can't really change voting laws nationwide very easily, but it does seem that some states are doing the job for him of restricting rights. The Brennan Center reported that states passed a total of like 79 restrictive laws just since 2021. And then you have places like North Carolina where the GOP has basically taken control of election administration, and they're suing to toss out 60,000 votes. I think they just lost. But you've had a lot of that kind of meddling, and then places like Missouri, which is one of those states that has tried to limit third-party voter registration efforts. What's your take on the balance of what's going on in the states as far as restrictive versus expansive, and what can voters do to protect themselves?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right that although Trump unilaterally cannot change election rules, of course he could try to convince Congress to do so, and Congress does have the power. Many states, and it's not just since Trump has taken office, it's been over the past several years and past couple of decades. A lot of states have imposed new voter restrictions, whether it comes to strict voter ID laws, cutbacks on early voting, rules with respect to mail-in ballots, registration restrictions, etc. So that is really where the activity is and the concern is. And unfortunately, what we're starting to see is essentially two Americas, where you have the red states with one set of rules that are much more restrictive, and the blue states with another set of rules, which are expand voter access. And that obviously shouldn't be the case. We should have a set of best practices where we all agree on these are the rules of the game that make sense. I often equate it to a sports analogy, since I'm a big sports fan, and we're recording this right after the Super Bowl, so I can use that with the Eagles and the Chiefs. And imagine the Eagles and the Chiefs were about to play the Super Bowl, but the Eagles not only got to choose the referees, who all happen to be Eagles fans, but the Eagles got to choose the rules of the game for this particular game. No one would think that's fair, and people might say that the Eagles huge win perhaps was as a result of the unfair rules. That's not how we do it in sports, and it shouldn't be how we do it in elections either. And so we really need to think about how we can take off the partisan lenses and come up with rules that everyone would agree on, that's administered by neutral election officials. And as I mentioned, I think most election officials really do a good job of that part of it, but there's still the perception, especially with respect to the rules. What does this mean on a practical level is that state courts are going to become more and more important. in the fight for protecting voting rights. What we've seen, as Garrett mentioned in my book, The Court versus the Voters, I talk about how the Supreme Court has really been harmful with respect to the constitutional right to vote and protecting voters. And what that has meant is that litigants have turned to state courts and invoked state constitutions. Now, the good news for them is that virtually every state constitution affirmatively protects the right to vote. State constitutions have language that go beyond the U.S. Constitution in its provision of voting rights and go beyond the U.S. Constitution in the way it protects voters and protects elections, saying things like everyone in the state shall be a qualified voter, saying things like all elections in this state shall be free and equal or free and open. And we've seen some good court decisions at the state level striking down restrictive voting rules. And it's not just in the so-called blue states. I mean, you had the Montana Supreme Court issue a really good ruling striking down some voter restrictions invoking the state constitution. The Alaska Supreme Court struck down that state's partisan gerrymander under the state constitution. So this is where our energies, I think, need to be and need to focus on state courts, focus on state judges and those elections, and focus on arguments for why state constitutions can do the work of better protecting voters. And then finally, you ask, what can voters actually do? I think obviously advocate, stay informed, but another thing I've been thinking a lot about recently is the need to really revamp entirely the way we do civics education. And so, that can be a nonpartisan activity to really focus not only K through 12, but through adult civic education, to rethink the way in which we discuss democracy.
Josh, if you'll permit me to stay on this on a personal note, I'm a little phobic about these kind of restrictions on voting because I grew up in the segregated South and I grew up in Virginia, and that was a state where the votes of 12 to 15% of the eligible adults were enough to elect a governor because the right to vote was so carefully restricted. And V.O. Key wrote about Virginia, the Virginia of my childhood. By comparison, Mississippi is a hotbed of democracy. And I was 16 years old before we had what I would call a free election in Virginia. And I've been hauling people to the vote. I was hauling people to the polls when I lived there. And I saw registrars come out and threaten black voters and said, if there's any problem with you do know that if there's any problem with your registration, the FBI will investigate you, and it's a federal crime. Are we in danger of going back to that world? This has all happened within one lifetime, and are we going to be okay?
Yeah. So here's my response. The history of voting rights has been a constant ebb and flow of expansions and retractions, and some more expansions, and then contractions again. And it's kind of the 2 steps forward, 1 step back fate of things. And unfortunately, I think we're in a 1 step back phase of voting rights. I mean, I think that yes, we're going to see continued attempts to engage in voter suppression. A lot of that will fall on racial lines, as it always has in the history of our country, unfortunately. At the same time, I think people are really trying to find ways to fight back against that suppression. So, you ask, are we going to be okay? I think in the long term, yes. I have some, big concerns about some of the problems that are happening right now. I think that, for example, if the administration refuses to follow court orders, I mean, that's a real constitutional crisis. I get all these texts from friends being like, is Trump going to run for a 3rd term, or can we allow that? And I try to tell them, like, let's not go to the crazy. That is not going to happen. I mean, I think it's pretty clear that no court would say, yes, Trump can avoid the Constitution and run for a 3rd term. we need to focus on the things that actually might happen and could be really problematic. And so, following court orders, I think, given, some of the things that's been said by Vice President J.D. Vance recently, that's what's making me concerned. Will we go back to a point where there's outright voter suppression that is explicit? The horrible stories of a Black person can't register unless they can tell officials how many bubbles there are in a bar of soap. That was horrendous. And no, I don't think we'll go back to that sort of explicit voter suppression. I think instead we're going to get rules that sound like they're neutral but have a disproportionate effect on minority voters and others. And so the question again is, will the court stand up to fight back against those? Are we going to be okay in the long term? I'm an optimist, so I think yes. In the short term, we're in this unfortunate period of one step back, and that's why we need, all of us who care about democracy need to stand even taller and speak even louder against some of those efforts.
So what's your take on, in the short term, 2026 and 2028? How free, how fair are those elections going to be?
Well, one, we will have elections in 2026 and 2028, contrary to some of my friends' fears. And two, I think we will have fair elections because, again, the people on the ground are dedicated public servants to ensuring that we will have a free and fair election, and election counts are done at the local level, and so that prevents a sort of widespread fraud occurring, etc. Will it be harder for some people to vote? Maybe. Will that can that skew outcomes at the margins? Yes. And so my hope is that whichever side wins, it's a landslide. Such that you have more legitimacy. I mean, that's one virtue of the 2024 election, is that no one really questioned it because the results seem pretty darn clear. Except for this North Carolina Supreme Court race, which came down to 734 votes out of 5.5 million cast. And lo and behold, the candidate down in the count is trying to throw out 60,000 votes as a result. But yes, I do think that the 2026 elections and 2028 presidential election will happen and will generally be free and fair. But to me, the question is, are we going to have continued voter suppression tactics, ways to try to skew the electorate at the, indirectly, which could have an impact. And so we need to be preparing for those sorts of possibilities right now.
It's actually kind of insane that we even have to say that the 2026 elections will happen.
Yeah, it's totally insane. But I hear this from it's really people on the left, to be honest, who are thinking about up the latest crazy conspiracy theories. But so at least try to assure them of that.
Well, before we go, Josh, I think that we want to, I mean, first of all, people who enjoy your analysis should make sure to read the Washington Monthly website because you are a regular contributor and we value very much your perspective. But I understand you have another book coming along and that has to do with turnout. Can you tell us a little about that?
Yeah, so this is on the very early stages of the book writing process, so it probably won't be out for a couple of years. But it really stemmed from the day after the 2024 election, and this is something I've thought about a lot, but it came into focus to me the day after the 2024 election when I saw all these news stories and headlines talking about how voter turnout was strong, about how it was the second highest turnout in ever, second only to 2020. And so, the electorate was very engaged. And then I looked at the numbers and saw, well, turnout was 63.4%. So over a third of the electorate did not show up. So the working title for this book, I don't know if this is what I'll land on, but the working title is The Forgotten One Third, to talk about, how we sort of accept voter turnout at 60 something percent and even think that's strong. And that's, that's just the Super Bowl of elections, the biggest day with the presidential election. If you look at midterms, it's below 50%. If you look at the primary elections, where because of gerrymandering, this is often the only game in town at the primary level, and for legislative seats, and you have turnout of 20%. off-year elections for governor in some states, like in Virginia and New Jersey and Kentucky, have turnout of 20-25%. And so a very small slice of the electorate is actually choosing the leaders. And I'm not okay with that. I don't think that suggests a strong democracy. And so the book is going to talk about why we have such low voter turnout, and then various solutions that I think we should consider, which include revamping civics education, revamping the way we have media literacy, looking at examples from other countries. So a variety of different ideas to think about it. But I think we need to not accept that level of turnout as okay and just say, that equals strong voter turnout. No, 63.4% is not strong voter turnout, no matter, whether it's a historical high or not.
Well, on that note, we want to thank you very much for taking time to talk to us. And I want to remind readers that they can find more from you in your book, The Court versus the Voters, or on the Washington Monthly website.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Josh. That's it for this week from the Washington Monthly. I'm Ann Kim, and on behalf of my co-host, Garrett Epps, thank you for listening. If you like what you heard, don't forget to subscribe to our channel or wherever you get your podcasts. Have a wonderful week.